than a bottom-up ownership concept. But anyway, the English, who obviously did recognize forms of ownership, even though they did come from the king, but they were all trying to get it back again. Most everything was granted, of course, to powerful nobles who needed to be paid off for their services in the conquest to start with. So that's how most of the very large royal or noble families in England came about, was because they were with William on the boat coming over, so to speak, and because they played large, commanded a horse regiment or something like that, so they got large tracts. But anyway, they had a theory of wardship. I'll read what I've written down here. The English system, on the other hand, used its theory of wardship to escheat. You've heard that expression before, to escheat, we'll talk about in a second, vast amounts of land to the crown. They literally, in Ireland, they accelerated the process by literally kidnapping Irish children, noble children, such as O'Neill himself, and made them wards of state in order to ultimately acquire their land. And later on, I'm just skipping over here because we'll go into it in the second half. And later they did other things like making, putting a condition on the inheritance of land on becoming a Protestant. So, and the Irish kind of cheated them a little bit in that respect, that there would be 4 or 5 sons, and they'd kind of draw lots, and one of them had to become a Protestant, and he'd own the land. So that there's a good deal of that has come down through the ages, where there was like the token proddy was in there, even before the concept of the soup, which didn't come in until the middle of the famine years. If you had heard the expression of the supers, because the proselyters, said, we'll give you soup if you become a Protestant. But anyway, if you like, all of those abuses came from the fundamental concept of the ownership, that the king, if the king owned the land and he had to give out large portions of it to get certain things done, he was always trying to get it back again so he could give it out again or get the income from it. So they had lots of nasty tricks, and wardship was the total antithesis of, I hate to use the expression gavelkind, and that's why I want to leave it in that the Irish system was a protection of the rights of the child, whereas in fact the English system was where they actually used the future inheritance, the fact that this child was going to inherit this estate, so that if they could grab that child and work him into their world. And that's exactly what they did with Hugh O'Neill. They brought him over and as a, then knowing that he would become the owner of the vast estates. And then if they can make you into a traitor, then your land escheats to them by law. So that's how they will claim they gained ownership of a tremendous amount of land by tainting the owners of the land that they had previously fostered in their own house to become the owner, and of course they conferred other titles like the Earl of Tyrone, just to establish his ownership of the so therefore if he ever screws up, we get his land, so that it was a title with a purpose, so that they were made earls just to underline the fact that they're now under English law. So that the history of the 4 centuries that followed this great document that O'Neill drew up in a vain attempt to preserve the old Gaelic order of ownership of land can be explained in the rejection of it. So that the entire 400 years that followed were predictable in that it was dispossession after dispossession after dispossession, to the final cataclysm of the famine, where they had impoverished. They had not. There was nothing. There was no nobility. There was no middle. There was nothing. There was just entirely a compressed 8.5 million people down into the lowest possible levels, and only the English landlords at the top, to the point where it cracked. because the machine on which it ran, that 8.5 million people that was working the land and surviving on just one crop, one fuel in their engine, collapsed. So that they actually collapsed their own system, and then gradually over the remainder of the 19th century, they started to get back the ownership of the land. And we'll talk about that after the break. Thank you very much.
Is it okay to ask you?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Oh, thanks. I was going to ask, when you're talking about the young boy of 14 and the grandfather, what would be the age that someone might expect to live to? Like, how old would the grandfather be if well, I mean, I guess the grandfather would be 45 years old, possibly. 24.
Those that survived did quite well.
So that was the exception if you had a grandfather.
Well, no, there was probably going to be a grandpa or a grandma, and they probably actually lived to be a good age.
Like what age?
Right up to modern times, up to 80s.
Yes. Really?
Yeah.
It was ancient times?
Yes.
But then there was a time probably when they didn't, when that age went way down.
No, the way I see it is, there was a tremendous amount of mortality along the way, but a certain number did survive to great
If you got
age.
to a certain age, you could get one of them.
It seems that way.
And then what about, how did one become an ex-slave? How did you get away from, get not be a slave?
By being of use to the community, because the community gave, if you like, license for slavery, in the sense that yes, it was okay for this land over here to have English slaves or whatever, and they were tended to be foreigners. Did tend to be brought in. That was okay, but if that slave showed talent and was of great could be of great use to the community claimed him.
And said, we don't want him to be a slave.
You're not going to get to keep that kid on your own, or that person for yourself. We want to put him to good use. So that again is one of the great proofs that they were so community oriented, that the community actually was boss. They ruled the roost, and that the